Hello, and thank you all for joining us on this Buy American panel. My name is Scott Algeier. I'm the Executive Director of the Information Technology ISAC. It's my pleasure to be moderating this panel and to be part of the planning team for the conference. So I want to thank OASIS and the National Council of ISACs for their support of this event, and of course for all of the sponsors as well. We have an excellent panel today, panel discussion on do Buy American provisions help enhance supply chain security. We have a group of wonderful people and professionals and experts in the field to talk through this panel with us today. So Faye, everyone's information is available in the conference website, of course, but we have Faye Francy is with us, Chris Wlaschin and Norma Krayem. They're all awesome people, all friends of mine, and it's great to have them here on this session. They'll each have the chance to introduce themselves, but I do want to note that we do hope to take questions depending on my ability to moderate this appropriately. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. But for now, we'll get things kicked off with Chris. Has some, will introduce himself, have some opening remarks, and then we'll go to Norma and Faye. So Chris.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you to the ISACs and the and OASIS for doing a wonderful moderated presentation today. The previous panel members have been absolutely great and engaging. My name is Chris Wlaschin. I'm the SVP and CISO for election systems and software. We're one of the top 3 election companies in North America, providing election services across the US. I hope to talk to you today about an approach that we as a small business, ES&S, less than 500 employees, our approach to supply chain risk management, and try to answer the question, do Buy American initiatives enhance security? Looking forward to our panel's discussion, and over to Norma.
Great, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Scott. And it's great to be here with Faye. We do have an amazing panel. My name is Norma Krayem. I'm a vice president and chair of the Cybersecurity, Privacy, and Digital Innovation practice at Scoyoc Associates. I created a homeland practice actually in 2003, but more importantly, a cybersecurity practice in 2005. So I work with owners and operators as they deal with all hazards, all cybersecurity risks, including in supply chain. And before that, I worked at the U.S. Departments of Commerce, State, Transportation, and as a consultant at FEMA. Buy America is a very useful tool. I know we're going to talk about that today, but that is not the panacea. Yeah, I think that it is not the silver bullet to the problem that we're going to talk about as well. Thank you. Faye?
Thanks, Norma. It's really wonderful to be together with all of these great panelists and to see all of you here today. I am the Executive Director for the Automotive ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center. I'm sure most of you would know what that is, and certainly the equivalent to what Scott does in IT, we do it in automotive. And if I can get out of the way, I have a great logo, which really matters, right? So that connected vehicle is coming, IoT device on wheels, if you will. And we're really pleased to be here today to talk about how and what the impacts might be on the supply chain.
Yeah, awesome. So thank you, Faye. Thank you, Norma. So already we have some good content building with some potential questions. But Chris, why don't you kick things off a little bit and to talk to us about supply chain security from a small business?
Sure. Thank you, Scott. As mentioned by other panelists earlier today and in my opening remarks, supply chain security risk management applies to all businesses, large, medium, and small. And the degree with which you have success in managing your supply chain risks depend on the resources you apply to it. Now, as I mentioned, election systems and software is a small business. We have less than 500 employees. But through our partnerships with Homeland Security, CISA, the Center for Internet Security, and other organizations, we have developed a pretty robust and auditable supply chain security program. I'm going to share my screen and a few slides with you and walk you through how we are doing it as a small business, because you hear a lot about policies and templates and how small and medium businesses should apply what's being presented. I'm going to show you a successful example of what that looks like for us. Do I need a permission to share my screen?
You should be okay to do it, Chris.
Okay.
Yeah, you should be okay. You had it going before.
Okay, hang on just a second. Try once more. Apologize for the short delay.
All right.
Here we go. Bringing it up now.
There we go.
Supply
We got-
chain security at ES&S. At ES&S, we partner with a number of organizations, Homeland Security, CISA, with the Electronic Components Industry Association, with the Counterterrorism Task Group under Customs and Border Protection. We follow NIST standards, and we use a tool that's been developed by the Center for Internet Security to help election officials and technology manufacturers evaluate supply chains. Number one, these partnerships are essential to a small business or a medium-sized business who may not have the internal resources to complete a comprehensive supply chain risk management program. It's essential that you partner with these organizations and the ISACs who have already done a lot of the legwork to help you understand the risk, categorize your risk, and then manage it. At ES&S, our supply chain risk management starts with product requirements. Since our equipment is purpose-built, meaning that we design and build through contract manufacturing partners, we design and build our own equipment, we have the opportunity to select parts and components from a global supply chain that meet our needs. We make sure that those components are tested, that the parts suppliers, the chip foundries, anywhere that these parts come from, that they are vetted. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. Some considerations that a small or medium-sized business might want to think about. It's a reality, a fact of life, folks. Our global supply chain involves hundreds of countries. And it's not just ES&S, but all major technology manufacturers. You have to carefully review where you get those parts. You know, we buy parts from American parts suppliers. Where do those folks get their parts from? The global supply chain. So there has to be a way to vet those part suppliers to make sure that they're trusted sources, to evaluate the risk of using one set of parts over another, and to make sure that everything is under a managed process or an engineering change control regime, so that you can be assured that every part that goes into your components, your equipment, your organization are vetted, tested, and reliable. We do thorough security reviews of all of our primary supply chain providers and some of their primary supply chain providers to make sure that everything we buy and build is trusted, tested, and free of defects. We are able to do this by using a NIST framework for monitoring supply chain security, and we do on-site visits. Some of the pictures you're going to see here I have taken of the parts manufacturers. And in this particular picture, somebody is getting ready to test a certain component. The supply chain steps that we follow, and again, these are based on Homeland Security, NIST, and Center for Internet Security best practices, include the vetting of the parts manufacturer, authentication of the parts, the assembly, the testing, any importing that needs to be done, final configuration and validation. What does it mean to vet a supply chain partner? They must undergo a multi-point in-depth check for security, safety, and reliability to make sure that they are doing all that they say they are doing to protect their supply chains. Product authentication, this is a critical element, and our partnership with the Electronic Components Industry Association, the standards that they produce allow us to only work with suppliers who are authorized to provide parts. The assembly is probably the most critical part of any supply chain risk assessment. You have to be able to go to the place where the parts are built to assess their manufacturing processes, make sure that they're ISO compliant, make sure that their employees and their systems and their processes are actually performing the way they say they do, and then to make sure that they remain that way through regular visits and audits. Assembly, where our contract manufacturers use their own quality assessment teams and ours, make sure that these parts, as they are mated to printed circuit boards or put into sub-assemblies before final assembly, make sure that they meet all the standards that are provided in the contract. We work with the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, the CTPAT, a program provided by U.S. Customs and Border Protection to make sure that any sub-assemblies or parts coming from overseas are in locked and sealed containers, and that the chain of custody is maintained from end to end. That's a critical element of making sure that parts come to U.S. shores are exactly the ones that you're asking for and no others. Our final configuration and validation takes place in Omaha, Nebraska, where we mate the sub-assemblies into the finished components. We write the code, the software and firmware here in Omaha to make sure that it is pristine and only that is present on this equipment. Sometimes that's not possible for COTS based equipment because it's built completely overseas. The firmware is loaded. We make sure that our purpose-built equipment only has the pristine software and firmware that is allowed to be on it and nothing else. And then we take that, again, chain of custody has to be monitored thoroughly. We take those finished parts, our software and firmware, and deliver it to the customer. Now, if a small company like ES&S with less than 500 employees can do this, you can too. If you're a small or medium-sized business, you need to wrap your head around the standards, the guidelines, the templates that Homeland Security, CISA, and the Center for Internet Security have provided. They're accessible, they're free. You develop your program, you implement it, you test it, and you modify it to make sure that it's working for you. Now, to the essential question of our panel, does Buy American initiatives improve supply chain security? Well, I can tell you that it does improve our economic stance, the ability to protect our components and the essential critical infrastructure that we build and use here in the United States. But even if these parts were built in the United States, a savvy supply chain risk management program will still vet those parts, vet the processes, vet the manufacturers. So in my mind, it really doesn't matter where components come from. It's how you vet them for authenticity and provenance to make sure that they only do what they're supposed to do. So I welcome your comments and questions, and let me pass it back to our moderator for the next panelist.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Appreciate that rundown of supply chain security within your company. So, Faye, we heard from Chris and his perspective. So you work with global auto manufacturers. In your previous life, you worked in the aviation industry. So you have thousands and thousands of suppliers in these. So talk a little bit about the reality of the supply chain in your space.
Thank you, Scott. So the supply chain is huge in the automotive. It can take anywhere from 15 to 20,000 suppliers to build one vehicle. And when you look at that, that's fairly daunting. The idea of Buy American, a great idea, but probably not realistic. Having said that, I think Chris laid out a really great set of steps and processes that they're using. All of us that are in the industry of large supply chains recognize that that is what you have to do, right? Very, very critical. But I do want to point out a couple of facts. So if you look at a recent Gartner study, over 89% of companies have had supply chain impacts in the last 5 years. That's huge. If we look at what's been going on with ransomware, just most recently since COVID, it's increased 300%. And both of these can be combined into one element, and it is the human element. So how do we manage this via the human element is an area where a lot of people don't talk about. It's really around education and training, awareness, and really bringing in your good engineering best practices, your security by design best practices, but really managing and educating that human element and getting prepared for when there is in fact an event.
Yeah, thank you, Faye. So we'll come back to that human element in a second. Yeah, so there's a lot there to unpack in the human element. But before we do that, let's turn over to Norma. And Norma, you had some, you were kind of teasing us with in your opening statements that you had more thoughts on this. So please share.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that. You know, one of the things I think that is important, and I love the topic of this panel overall, not just supply chain because it's so critical, but whether or not Buy America or Buy American, they're actually two. Faye knows in the transportation industry, there's a separate requirement. It is a really interesting proposal. But the point at the end of the day, excuse me, I have a little summer cold, is that it is not the silver bullet. Because the whole point of Buy America or Buy American is really about the domestic industry, right? Supporting US industries overall. Just because you're buying a greater percentage of your content from a US company does not necessarily ensure that you have the most secure supply chain. Now, that's just for different reasons, though, than we're talking about. Because when we talk about supply chain security, we've always worried about this issue, whether it was right after 9/11, and when I actually worked on the creation of CTPAT, we were worried about WMMDs coming through cargo containers. And we went to the point of origin, to the point of manufacturing, all the way through to make sure that the supply chain was secure. But at the end of the day, we're talking about combined cyber physical issues, and just content, just US content even, it doesn't make it the most secure. Now, that doesn't mean that US companies are doing something wrong. What we are saying is that supply chain security has to be applied whether you're buying products and services in the United States, you're using vendors in the United States, or you're using vendors around the world. I think the lesson learned certainly with Huawei and ZTE, and that honestly from a national security perspective, everyone should be aware of, when you're talking about nation states and non-state actors, they have a very different approach to what their intent is. So for any country to not understand that China is interested to infiltrate your supply chain and to take information from it, you're lucky if it's just an exfil, right? But the point is, you know, whether it's the data exfil, IP loss, or actual harm, what we want people to do when you think about supply chain risk is think about all hazards. So the best example, and I'm going to use a transportation one, but not automotive, Faye, so don't get worried. Phew. When we think about transportation issues, think about even mass transit or rail, right? You know, when we talk about those procurements, even state and local governments are doing those procurements. These are long-term contracts, and they're buying shells, they're buying the electronic equipment, they're buying the software and hardware from all over. That's a good example where we just haven't seen as much focus on cybersecurity in the supply chain overall. You know, I'll say this and then stop. I think what we want people to understand when you think about supply chain security, again, is all hazards, right? We have nation state risks, we have people, we have criminals. You know, if anyone has ever done a lot of work with the Department of Defense, you know about concerns about counterfeit materials or even just traditionally. So if you take the all hazards approach, you can integrate Buy America, Buy American, or in cybersecurity issues. And I know, Scott, I think in a different panel, you've talked about all the work you're doing in the ICT Supply Chain Task Force with the Department of Homeland Security, but they all have to be integrated in. There isn't really one solution to the problem.
Yeah, so thank you. Again, lots there. So we'll, yeah, but so there's one of the things we talked about in the last panel, which you talked a little bit about here as well, is there's an economic value to having strong American companies who can supply these materials and provide these services. But the reality is that we're not at a point where all this can be done by all American companies. So
that's a great point, Scott. If I may jump in there,
yeah.
I think that's a fabulous point, a very, very important point. I think it's very obvious that there's the supply chain is very long and complicated, and to unravel that and to start producing it here, that's probably a 10-year term. I'll tell you a story of Well, from aviation. So we're in India, right? We're in India for some other reasons to put some R&D in there. We're visiting some various companies. I've got my chief from Boeing Commercial Aircraft. And the company presenter said, oh, and by the way, we already work for Boeing. And he goes, what? He goes, oh yeah, we work for you actually. And he goes, excuse me, I don't think I know you. And he said, I don't even know this company. I've never heard of this company before. Well, they were a tier 3 supplier. And little did he know that whole bunny trail, if you will, maybe tier 4 supplier. And yet the individual went to his office, came back with a signed copy of a contract that had his name on it. So this just shows you the challenge of saying Buy America. It's a hard challenge to get to. Are there other techniques and tactics that we can use? And I think Chris laid a few of those out in ensuring that what we are doing is secure and built appropriately.
Sure. Go ahead, Chris, you had a comment?
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. Faye mentioned that while it's a goal to have American owned and operated companies providing parts to suppliers to build American products, it's not the panacea. I like the idea of repatriating jobs that have been offshored over the past several decades to create American manufacturing for everything from integrated circuit chips to touch screens that are used in a variety of electronics. But right now, many of those components, the places where they're built are located next to the raw materials that are required for their construction. Some of these rare earth metals are only found a few places on Earth. We can't fix that problem. We can't move the raw materials to the US. So how do we make sure that those parts and pieces are trustworthy? As CISA, as Center for Internet Security has said in the past, you have to verify, trust but verify that every component, every part of the manufacturing process is done in a way that can be auditable, traceable, and you can prove the authenticity of the part. That is as Faye said, a 10-year effort. And we can't wait. We can't stop what we're doing and wait for that to happen. So we have to have processes in place to validate the authenticity of those parts now.
Scott, I just want to add one point. I think when Buy American was created, I think that was what, 1933, we should all focus on what the actual intent was. The intent was to build up the US industrial base, to have, core skill sets and components within our economy and job creation. And that's still really the bottom line premise. It's still a tool to address security issues. But I do think that people look at that as the solution to the problem. And we probably hit that nail over the head 5 times already, but it's a tool. It's not the end of all be all. And I think and maybe you want to talk about this, but the President Biden's supply chain security executive order looked at those all hazards approach, right? Pandemic was a great reason, but you do have to worry about, different types of risks as well.
Yeah, sure. So your point here about Buy America remind me of when I was a kid in the mid 80s. I'd go down to visit my grandfather for spring training, and he had on the back of his Ford pickup truck, he had a bumper sticker that said, Buy American, the job you save may be yours, which is really interesting. And now, Faye, I was, on the road trip with the family, and we passed, we're in Atlanta, and we drive through, there's a Kia plant. And I think we were driving through, I wasn't sure if it was Georgia or whether it was Alabama, but there's a Hyundai assembly plant. So what does Buy American mean today anyway, right? So anyone want to talk about that?
Well, it's a great point. And we know that there are regulations about how much content has to be produced in an automobile before it can be claimed to be built in America. And the automotive industry balances that act quite a bit. And there's a certain percentage of the content that has to be American. Businesses will decide based on a make-buy decision what is the best way to proceed, and that we shouldn't limit, right? They will find the right parts and materials and use the right processes, I believe, to ensure that we do have a solid supply chain. Having said that, I think it's really a good conversation because there are a lot of concerns today and certainly in the recent past of why we won't even think about something like that. Can we close those borders and say we're just going to do it here? And I think we all agree so far. What I'm hearing on the panel is that just doesn't seem to be feasible in this really global economy today.
Right. So next topic then, right? If it's not possible to do it in a global economy, and what is American, right, versus built and assembled, we all agree you need the processes and you need to do the risk management. So what are those processes, right? How do you do the risk management if you have, whether you're a small company with limited resources or whether you're a large company with, 15 or 20,000 suppliers? Well, where do you go to make sure you have these right processes in place? And how do you kind of build the team to do that?
Well, I'll
Anyway,
start.
yeah.
CISA has been very proactive. You heard from a previous panel member, there are working groups studying this problem to help critical infrastructure, private sector owners and operators improve supply chain security. CISA has published templates, vetted supplier lists. There are programs out there that help the Department of Defense and the federal government work through the process of evaluating trusted suppliers, contracting with them, making sure the contract language is there. For a small business, the resources that we use were the CISA templates and guides and best practices. The Center for Internet Security has published procurement guides for election technology providers and election officials, and just distilling those guides into a checklist that you can manage. And it comes down to a checklist in my mind, a checklist that you can manage, you can create and manage for your business. That first step is to identify the primary suppliers or the contract manufacturers. You have to know who you're working with that is providing input to your supply chain, and then engaging with them, seeing what they're doing to manage their supply chain risk management. It starts with a conversation, relationship building, and relying on the tools and templates that CISA and other organizations have provided.
And we can't forget our really good friends at NIST who have outlined a lot of this in the NIST cybersecurity framework, along with, they have a whole supply chain activity 8276 and so forth. They do a fabulous job. I think it gets back to, Scott, the point that you're trying to make is, how do you build that out? Because you have to have people. So I get back to the people element here. It's very hard for some of these smaller organizations that, have one IT guy, if they're lucky. How do I build out a cybersecurity NIST framework for my supply chain? That's a pretty daunting task. And so you really do need to examine, how do I approach this? What can I do that's, that I can manage, right? One of the challenges for the ISAC is, we use a motto, you're only as strong as your weakest link. So we really all have to be in this together and responsible and helping each other in that long and deep supply chain to really understand how to do this.
Scott, the only piece I would add to that, there's commonalities between large companies, small companies in what the building blocks are. And I think what we're saying is you have to create, a supply chain security program that includes every aspect of the business. So the buyers of the service somewhere in your organization can't be off on their own, just purchasing items or entering into contracts. What you really need is an enterprise risk management structure that includes supply chain and all components of the company, big or small. Then you really have, hopefully you do have a trusted supplier program. I mentioned the counterfeit program because for a long time, people only really had that. So if you have that, it's easy to build on it. If you don't have anything, right, creating a trusted supplier program, but also holding them to the standards, that NIST, as Faye was referring to make sure that they know that they have to use them. And then you have to deconstruct the supply chain. If you are a big company, I'm not saying this is an easy job, but having worked with very large companies trying to do exactly that, you had to pick a product, right? And they made decisions on how to do it, highest volume, highest risk, looked at the major sourcing providers. And they did create, the checklist, you have to have that. But eventually you actually have to go check, right? Anyone can lie on a checklist. And so when you talk about a full audit of a factory or a supply chain, again, these are very difficult things. I know that you already worked through this as you deal with ICT task force, but people have to think about it all the way through, because at the end of the day, if you're selling motherboards and your motherboards are, being sourced from pick a country X, then that could be a problem. That is something you need to fully audit, not just do as a checklist.
I love
Back-
what Norma just said about building a culture of risk management, not just supply chain, but operational risk, IT risk. That emanates from the boardroom. It emanates from the executive leadership team, from the CEO on down. If he or she are paying attention to supply chain risks, you can bet that everybody else underneath them will be too. Establishing a risk management review could be a quarterly meeting of the executive team, the supply chain or procurement teams, to identify and understand that risk, and then use well-proven risk management strategies to identify risk, to mitigate it, to buy it down, or in some cases to accept that risk. It starts with that corporate culture, and I believe that emanates from the company leadership.
And the supply chain activities more recently, and I think also through OASIS, you've seen some conversations around it. I know the next panel will be talking about the software bill of materials. So that's really important in the cyber stream of things. And I know in automotive, we have a group that is the supplier affinity group has decided that they are going to focus on building an automotive SBOM. Really important, because it starts to get into where are these things built? How are they built? Are they secure? And into a lot of the tactics and techniques that we've talked about earlier. So that is one additional tool that'll be in the toolkit to help folks.
Yeah, awesome. So again, there's lots here, right? So ensuring that that it's not just a checklist, right? Like the concept of trust but verify. Yes, makes sense, right? You need to make sure that because a lot of times they'll see a checklist as, oh, I should be doing this. I'm not, but if I say I'm not doing it, I'm going to cause all sorts of problems for myself. I'll just click this box and they'll go away, right? But who has the resources to go in and confirm every time that, to review this every time that someone, you get a paperwork back from your 15,000 suppliers that they're actually doing this. So I get the concept that, we need to manage it, and it needs to be, you need a program in place. But at what point do you determine, or how do you determine which of these vendors I'm going to go up and follow up with, and which ones I'm just going to say, okay, they check the box, and I'm going to trust that it's valid? Do you prioritize based on the component? This component is more essential than other components, or maybe so how do you do that, right, when you begin? So Chris, maybe I'll ask you on that first.
Sure, great question, Scott, and that's exactly our approach. In the device you see behind me, that is a ballot marking device. It's basically an electronic pen that helps disabled voters indicate their choices, and a paper ballot card is produced. There are 232 parts that go into the manufacture of that device. Of those 232 parts, only 9 represent a critical function that is relied upon to make sure that device operates properly. So we've traced all 9 of those parts to their original source of their manufacturer. Believe me, it does take work. It does take considerable effort for our engineering team, for our design team, and then for me and the risk management team to go out and verify that the parts that we're buying are exactly the ones that we asked for in our design spec. So when you distill that down from hundreds of parts, or maybe thousands in the case of a car, to the ones that are critical functions, provide critical functions, it helps make the cream rise to the top. It helps you focus your efforts so that you're not looking at hundreds or thousands of parts, you're looking at the 9 or 10 or 20 that are the most meaningful to provide that device's operation.
Finding those crown jewels, right, Chris? But also, you know, if you take a step up from the technical piece and look at it strategically from a company, this again gets back to how important it is to be working together, the product engineers, the supplier managers, the legal teams, understanding what are the right contracts to be putting in place that have the appropriate language, and what you will be doing with either testing and verification and so forth, and what your expectations are regarding that product, supply chain product that you're receiving. So understanding that and building that force, if you will, of how you approach this is really critical for particularly the OEM or the integrator, depending on who it may be. And the integrator really ultimately is probably responsible and usually the one that may have to go to the regulator. Having said that, there are some interesting stories I can tell regarding a supplier who supplies in multiple different areas and different sectors, right? And supplied I'll just say a part. It was a software part. And in my own company back at Boeing, that part was supplied in various places. And one of the places we discovered it had malware on it when it was given to us. Well, we forgot to share that. So this gets back to why an ISAC? We forgot to share that actually with anybody else except for our division. And a couple months later, I'm talking to some folks in another division, and guess what? They're having the same problem. And I said, gee, that sounds like an awful familiar problem. We had something like that over here. Can we look at it? And sure enough, it was the same supplier, but they had a different trademark. And you know, this happens all the time. So why am I bringing this point up? If we had shared, the other group wouldn't have had to go through that, and they lost some production and there were some issues, right? This information sharing is really critical, and you have suppliers that supply in multiple different areas. We had a conversation with a couple of them in automotive one day, and one of them said, you know, it's interesting that you bring up the people element and the whole idea about, you know, getting, you know, everybody on the same page, the lawyers, the supplier, contractors, et cetera. He says, because I have the same product that I supply to like 10 different industries, and they all have different requirements for me. And a lot of them don't even have cyber in them. And the ones that have really good cyber requirements, I'm not going to tell the other ones because it costs more money, say. So again, how do we do that? And how do we really start to learn from each other and really start implementing those best practices across the board? Really critical for success.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you for that, Faye. I mean, there's, again, every time you and Chris and Norma talk, there's more to unpack, but one of the issues I want to unpack is liability, and the liability concerns for companies in managing their supply chains. So Norma, when you're advising these companies, I know you're not a lawyer, but when you're talking with companies, I'm sure liability is a concern of theirs. So what does this conversation look like?
You know, that's a really good point. And it's a very complicated one. And I will say my disclaimer, Scott said, I am not a lawyer. I do not play one on TV. But actually having written many of the cybersecurity requirements that are put in contracts, because sometimes lawyers don't know what cybersecurity is, this is easy. I think it is important, when you're when you think about liability and assigning risk, when you're the biggest, on the top of the food chain, what you're doing is flowing all of that down, and you do it through contracts. That is an easy way to do it, but that doesn't mean that is going to solve the problem. The other part I think that is really important, well, you want to flow it down because you have to. In many cases, if you are a heavily regulated entity, like in the case of the banking financial services sector, they are regulated for these issues and they're mandated to do the flow down. But there is an evaluation you have to do if you are the mothership, or if you're the smaller company in the supply chain, as to how much you're really ever going to recoup, right? You may have like 5,000 small companies that you rely on, and you can put whatever language makes you happy in that contract, but you'll never recoup it. I mean, you could sue the living bejesus out of them after the fact, 10 years after you have a class action lawsuit, but that's not really the point. What we do have to do is make sure that we are clear, whether it's in contracts or relationships, down the supply chain, that there are standards that must be met, right? That you will audit and you will check them. And if they do not meet those requirements, then you will no longer do business with them. Now, I'm not saying that this is the solution to the problem, because liability is very, very hard. But it is part of the issue. If eventually the vendor community, with whoever is the biggest dog in this discussion, comes to a place where everyone has cybersecurity requirements built in, right? Cyber by design, privacy by design, then I think it's a little bit easier. Now, there is one difference, and that is it has to be bespoke to an industry, because if you are a medical device manufacturer, then liability is a much different discussion. If you are a hospital, or you're running a hospital chain and you're buying SCADA equipment that you're then connecting into your own IT systems that could impact the health and well-being of people in a hospital, that's a different liability construct. So the challenge, of course, is liability has to be scoped to where the harm how the harm could impact, whether it's your marketplace, your stock prices, or people. So it's a very hard discussion, but it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, that's really insightful, I think. From a company perspective, you really can't make the liability go away, correct? So you
That's right.
need to address it, right? So you're ultimately going to be held liable for it. So you need to, you just can't pass this off on someone else. It's your responsibility to go and work with your partners, your supply chain partners, to ensure that they're real, that they're engaged, that they're meeting to the requirements that you set out for them.
I'll just say this and then stop. There is a sort of a social contract that companies have with everyday Americans, and that is that if you are in a hospital buying a product, buying a car, whatever that it is, that you are selling them something they believe that is safe and secure. They don't believe that you are selling them a product that can do them harm. And I think we are starting to see that ripple effect in the economy when we see more cybersecurity impacts about what that relationship is. And I think if more companies look at it that way, and I know that they do already, I think it will help raise, I hate this term, but the cyber hygiene of all companies across the US and around the world.
All right, super. So before we move on, I just want to note that, if you do have, we are running short of time. So if you do have questions or comments, please put them in the chat and I'll do my best to get to them. But Faye, I promised in the beginning that I would come back to you to unpack this human element component that you touched on in the beginning and touched on in another remark. So yes, what is the human components? You touched on training, but there's also, let's face it, in reality, there are countries who are trying to get intellectual property, and they try to do this through various means, including placing people in trying to get them placed in valuable posts and valuable companies. So what are some of your thoughts on how to do this? I mean, is it, in the same way that we have a buy American? Is there a don't buy or exclude, or do you, I mean, how do you make these, how do you manage the human element in this complex supply chain when you can't control who some of these employees are?
Well, it gets back again to people, processes, and techniques, right? And really implementing what would be good hygiene in vetting anyone that comes to work for you, right? Because we all know that, everyone in large scale companies have been affected by folks that have gotten in for espionage purposes and so forth. We see it from all the big boys that's happened. So even the best of us get hit. So again, I think that gets to very robust HR vetting, and clearly there's a legal side of this. But again, as Norma was saying, with the legal side, yeah, you got a piece of paper, but you still have your intellectual property is gone. What do you do? There needs to be international laws and that need to be aligned. We saw recently with the Colonial Pipeline how interesting that was with our government going after the actual Bitcoin. I was surprised they were able to do that. So we're going to see a shifting tide and understanding of how we do this on a global stage. Really very difficult. But if you stay on the people part, again, it's good vetting for the people, and then it's of course training the people and ensuring that you've got processes in place, that people are taking this seriously, they understand what the cyber threat is, and that you are training people on what to do and what links not to hit. 95% of all breaches are caused by human error. 95%. That is pretty stunning, if you ask me. So how do you work through that? And I think, Scott, where you were going was a little bit more nefarious. This is really a targeted attack where we're going to put somebody in somebody's facility because we want them to steal some secrets. And that's really hard to fight against. But there's, of course, tactics on that as well.
Right. So, yes. So the human element, you're right. There were lots of good people, well-intentioned, oops, maybe I shouldn't have clicked on this link because there really wasn't an invoice from my supplier. And now things are compromised. And then there's the more malicious, whether a person is planted in there or by a government authority or a nation state, or they just have an allegiance and say, hey, look, I want to take this and remove and take this knowledge and benefit my home country, or this, whatever the case might be. So Chris, don't know if you have any thoughts on that, and then we'll turn it back over to Norma.
I do, Scott, thank you. My final comment today is the IT-ISAC, the ICT group, they are great at information sharing, but I want to foot stomp a program that many members may not be aware of. It's called the Private Sector Clearance Program. It's a program operated by Homeland Security to give private sector owner and operators of critical infrastructure security clearances so that you can interact with the intelligence community and law enforcement who may be working behind the scenes to identify threats to our supply chain, to critical infrastructure providers, and have more time to react, to understand a threat, and more time to react before something bad happens or something terrible is made public. By having a security clearance and being able to communicate with our intelligence community and law enforcement elements of Homeland Security, I think it's a really good program to be involved with, because the more information you have about the threats to your organization or your industry, the better you'll be able to prepare for, react, and build resilience.
Yeah, thank you. So Norma, do you have any thoughts on the human elements?
I do. I think it is such an important topic. The one piece I would mention that maybe that is different, that I've spent a lot of time on, is helping companies with their HR staff understanding what cybersecurity is. And about 2 years ago, I think I did an hour-long presentation to about 100 HR professionals across one particular sector to just explain to them not only what cybersecurity is, but why HR needs to be part of the broader team within a company looking at cyber risk. So whether it's, insider threat or just the basics, right? Least privilege access. No one should have access to something unless they need to. Employees will leave companies and HR will forget to tell IT to turn off their access. So there's so many pieces of the human element that are common sense, but for all companies, make sure that you are integrating your HR professionals in that. And again, common sense things that can really help address cybersecurity risk.
Yeah, so we had we in the IT-ISAC built out a starter guide for combating the insider threats. And one of the points, I interviewed one of the people who helped us with that on the podcast. And one of the points that they made was, hey, if you have a cybersecurity program, you already have the makings of an insider threat mitigation program. So that's, there's ways to start, and you shouldn't be overwhelmed by the thought of instituting these programs. So we did get a question in the chat, which, I'll throw it out to everybody. It was related to the liability discussion. And the question is, liability, one issue in liability is reasonableness. What is reasonable to be expected? How do you see the definition changing for what is reasonable in cybersecurity? I think that's a really interesting question. I don't think you need to be a lawyer to answer that, but I think it's just, if anyone wants to comment on that, I think that's an interesting question.
I'm happy to jump in, Faye, unless you wanted to.
Please, Norma, go.
Faye's like, no. Faye's like, no, you can take this one. There are two ways to answer this question. There is a particular term of art called reasonableness, which the Federal Trade Commission actually enforces. I'll go back to my social contract example, and that is the way the Federal Trade Commission has actually enforced it, and the way I think that it is evolving is very basic. FTC has mostly used this in example against hotels, where hotels have said, you're giving me your PII, your personally identifiable information, because you're booking a service, and I have a privacy policy on my website, and I'm telling you I'm protecting your data, and it will only be used for certain purposes. And then, of course, that particular hotel didn't protect it, and there was a major data breach, and off goes your data. I think the evolution is going to be, again, it goes back to, if you're buying, we have water and wastewater systems. And so as a consumer, you expect that you will have clean water and there will not be sewage in the streets. It's a social compact. But if there's a cybersecurity attack, right, the definition of reasonableness is different. If you're buying an implantable medical device, you expect that the medical device will protect you, not kill you. So again, I think that definition is going to change and evolve over time. And the piece I always like to say, with the Norma's opinion only, not on behalf of anyone, is as corporate America is adding digital innovation, technology, tools, AI, whatever that it may be, remember, the more you're adding the autonomy part, where you're taking the human out of it, my opinion, you are actually putting more responsibility back on yourself. Because if I'm going to get into something that is supposed to think for me or do something for me, it's not my responsibility anymore if there's an issue or a problem. And so I think the definition of what is reasonable today is very different than what it will be tomorrow and as we go forward. And my last example, we've talked about, you've seen all the discussions about the cameras that people buy to watch their children while you're home. Well, you expect there is reasonable security. You don't expect someone to be able to hack into that and scare your child. So I think there's a yin and a yang to how this needs to go, and it's going to change, but it's a little complicated.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. That's a really thorough answer. Thank you. So we have 2 minutes. We have 3 panelists, so that gives you each less than a minute for final words or any final thoughts. So Norma, I guess we have you. So would you like to go next?
Sure. I'll just say this. I think the scope of this panel was a perfect one, because the concepts of cybersecurity risk and supply chain are things that we all understand and know that we have to work on, but they're complicated. I think also debunking the potential protections of Buy America, Buy American are really important. But I think what we have heard today is that this is still a very difficult, complicated problem that really needs everyone to dig in and work together to help address the risk. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Chris.
Yeah, I think you've heard from the panelists today that supply chain risk management is not insurmountable. It is a large, complex problem, but through partnerships, through collaboration and information sharing, you can build a cybersecurity or supply chain risk management program that's effective, but only if you're partnering with other people and other organizations. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Faye.
I'll keep it short. So they both said great things, and I agree with all of them. But in addition to that, I'll just say very simply, cybersecurity is everybody's responsibility. Take it that way. Take it seriously.
Awesome. Great. You did it. We have a couple seconds to spare. So thank you, Chris, Norma, and Faye for the session, for joining us. Thank you to the audience for participating in the event and participating in the conference. And just thank you all for everything, and have a great day.
Thank you to our great moderator.
Yeah, you're welcome.